Welcome back, everyone. We have Gustavus Adolphus, the father of modern warfare. Maybe I said that right. King of Sweden, early 17th century, 30 Years' War. Not sure if this is part of the 30 Years' War, because I don't really know much about this time frame. This is what we're going to do today. We're going to react and learn. Glad you're here with me. SandRhoman History, really good channel. We've seen a few of his videos so far. Let's jump right in. Glad you're here with me.
The military reforms of Gustavus Adolphus changed the face of European warfare. His legacy, truly, was long-lasting, both in practical and historiographical terms. The historian Geoffrey Parker once noted that, quote, "If Gustavus Adolphus rose up from the dead and was magically transported to the Western Front in 1914, he would have understood the underlying concepts governing warfare with little difficulty." End quote. Gustavus Adolphus is often dubbed the father of modern warfare, a title which is usually linked to his famous success during the Swedish intervention in the 30 Years' War. But there is more to this story. In a time when musketeers and pikemen were becoming the most important part of the armies of Western Europe, and cavalry relied heavily on arquebuses and pistols instead of swords and lances, Gustavus faced an entirely different way of warfare in the East, the winged hussars. Many of Gustavus's later successes were due to lessons he learned in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they were learned the hard way. But let there be a word of caution. It is both very easy to overstate and understate Gustavus's military achievements. Much of the scholarly literature on this topic is contradictory, and the opinions of scholars on such an
I love the paper-esque animation. It's really interesting.
Influential figure inevitably vary. As always, all works cited are listed in the description below, or will appear on screen. This video dissects how varying historiographical traditions discuss Gustavus Adolphus's military reforms.
All right.
In 1611, when Gustavus Adolphus ascended the Swedish throne, he inherited three wars, one against Denmark-Norway, one against Muscovy, and lastly, one against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
What does this remind you of? The Great Northern War.
By 1621, Gustavus had successfully concluded the wars against Denmark, Norway, and Muscovy. Now, with quite a bit of military experience, he faced his most formidable enemy yet, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Prior to Gustavus's reign, the Polish had repeatedly bested the Swedish forces, for example at Kirchholm in 1605, or at Klushino in 1610. According to the historian Robert Frost, the Swedish defeats were largely due to the shock value of the superior Polish cavalry, the winged hussars. In stark contrast to the Western art of war, the Polish still relied on cavalry charges with lances to win the day. According to the historian Fridholm von Essen, Gustavus's reforms of the Swedish cavalry was heavily influenced by his experience in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the resulting new cavalry doctrine, Gustavus rekindled the shock value of cavalry, incorporated especially in charges with blank swords. For example, at the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, Gustavus ordered his cuirassiers to charge home with sabers and instructed them to use their pistols only at point-blank range in melee.
It's gotta be. This was an interesting time frame with how warfare is just changing so drastically at this point, where you're going a little bit less conventional. You're going more to win as well. You're also utilizing more and more muskets, like you said, pistols, and different usage of cavalry. Crazy time.
This had two advantages. Firstly, the pistols stood a much higher chance to pierce the armor of the enemies, and secondly, the impact of a resolute charge on the enemy's morale was devastating and routed enemies more frequently. Robert Frost notes that this was both peculiar and remarkable for Western observers, because cavalry warfare in the 16th and 17th century was heavily influenced by the use of wheel-lock pistols. Shock cavalry, meanwhile, had gradually declined because of social, economic, and tactical reasons, which we explained in our video about the Black Riders. In the 16th century, cavalry often rode close to enemies in waves and fired their wheel-lock pistols and then retired to the back. This tactic was called the caracole.
It's like a revolving door of continuous attacks. Very interesting. Smart too.
While modern historians disagree on the usefulness of this tactic, Gustavus certainly was not a fan of it.
Oh.
He relied on the combination of volley fire and quick cavalry charges to win the day. This was achieved by placing musketeers between his cavalry units on the flank. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, when he faced the renowned Black Riders of Pappenheim, some of the most feared horsemen of that time, he ordered his men to endure their caracoles stoically, and then, just after the first enemy rank had fired, he had his cavalry and musketeers fire together. Only then the Swedish cavalry would countercharge. As was common for them, they quickly bounced, exchanged pistol fire from melee range, hit a few enemies with their sabers, and then retreated. This gave the musketeers time to reload.
And it did not give Pappenheim time to reload.
After the cavalry's retreat, the musketeers delivered their second volley. This is a very fitting example for what many historians, such as Roberts, Parker and von Essen, see as the truly innovative part about Gustavus's military reforms: the exploitation of shock value with volleys and cavalry charges. It is often argued that Gustavus was the first to abandon the caracole. However, this is usually based on older views such as Michael Roberts's. More recent researchers such as Ronald S. Love point to primary sources dating from as early as the 1580s and 90s, which strongly indicate that cavalry was already expected to charge home with swords in the 16th century. So Gustavus was not the first to rekindle the shock value of charges, but he did abandon the caracole. Moreover, he usually relied on heavy cuirassiers and refrained from using lighter cavalry such as the mounted arquebusiers. The historian Olaf van Nimwegen summarizes this nicely. Gustavus was not the first to abandon the caracole, but he did popularize the shock value of cavalry once again. Shock value was also important for Gustavus's infantry tactics. In the early 17th century, Western military doctrine either followed the Dutch or the Spanish school. It is crucial.
Interesting. There's really just... Did I hear that? Is it very much a binary system?
To understand Gustavus's doctrine either followed the Dutch or the Spanish school. It is crucial to understand Gustavus's reforms in the context of these dominant military theories. The Spanish infantry was some of the best and most experienced of this time. It was deployed in a deep square and relied on the combination of pikemen, arquebusiers and musketeers, the so-called tercio. Many scholars such as Roberts and Parker noted that it was first and foremost this infantry formation that was responsible for the Spanish conquest of large parts of the world.
Oh. Okay. I mean, yeah, it was at the same time frame, I guess, at the age of exploration, but I'm guessing this formation was formidable towards the enemies that, well, they don't have anywhere near the capabilities, especially in the western part of the world.
Moreover, William Guthrie points out that the tercio was responsible for many of the shattering victories in favor of the Catholic imperials during the early stages of the 30 Years' War. Whether at White Mountain, Wimpfen or Luther, the tercios usually prevailed. Its depth and large numbers of pikes allowed it to successfully withstand cavalry charges, while the gunmen, who operated independently around the square, would shoot the enemies to pieces from a distance. Both the ability to defend themselves in all directions and the morale boost resulting from the depth of the squares were crucial advantages. Keep in mind that battles were usually won by driving the enemy off the field, not by killing them all.
Yeah, routing them basically.
So morale was often the decisive factor. The depth of the formation also allowed for an ongoing hail of fire. William Guthrie estimates that they could maintain a continuous fire for over an hour. This was done by the so-called countermarch. In the 17th century, musketeers would be deployed on the side or in front of the pikes. The first row would give fire and then retire.
Yeah, they would just... It's basically... I forget what it was called. That rotation that we were seeing with the cavalry continuously going back and forth. Start with the P. But standing. And continuation. It's like a revolve. Like, it's just evolving.
To the back to reload, while the next row would step up. However, the tercio's depth, probably some 20 to 30 men deep for the shot compartments, made it quite slow, and the countermarch did not allow all the musketeers to fire in unison. The Dutch model, in contrast, developed by Maurits of Nassau and his cousins, deployed much smaller units of only 10 ranks depth, which had more frontage in return. This meant the Dutch had greater firepower, but were quite susceptible to charges and outflanking. Many scholars see Gustavus' system as the perfect blend of the Spanish and the Dutch school.
Okay, so it's a hybrid of the two. Interesting, almost like a T format, but interesting.
Others argue that Gustavus showed how outdated the conservative Spanish school was at the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, where he soundly defeated the experienced imperial army under the renowned general Johann von Tilly. This is often linked to the Battle of Lützen just 1 year later. By then, the Imperials had adopted the Swedish system. However, David Parrott and Geoffrey Parker have argued that this is to overstate the case. The tercios were used later on, continued winning against their enemies after Breitenfeld, and repeatedly proved their flexibility and maneuverability in major battles. David Parrott, for example, points to the Battle of Nördlingen in 1634, where the imperial tercios decisively bested the Swedish Protestant force. Another example is the Battle of Rocroi, where the tercios, although ultimately losing the battle due to being defeated on the flanks, quickly and independently formed hollow squares when they were encircled by the French. So they proved that they were still maneuverable enough. Parker and von Essen stressed the fact that the tercios too were reformed by the 1590s, and often deployed in
really cool painting.
Smaller units as well. So, all in all, the imperial tercios were still the towering military Goliath against which the success of military reforms was measured. Gustavus's military reforms drew on Maurits of Orange's Dutch school quite a bit. Maurits had gathered a lot of experience in fighting the Spanish in the 80 Years' War. In his formation,
I don't even know about the 80 Years' War. I'm so novice.
Of smaller units, he had taken inspiration from classical antiquity, especially the Roman manipular system. In order to secure these formations, he organized his men in a checkerboard pattern. Although the tercios also adopted this in many battles, they usually preferred a wedged or diamond formation. Maurits, moreover, reduced the number of melee fighters and increased the musketeers.
Good, right? And you'll see a continuation of that until it's really, you know, the blades are gonna come into obscurity all the way up to like the late 19th century. You're gonna have some sabers. You're gonna obviously adapt muskets with bayonets. Even though they might have it here. Well, they had it in the 18th century, obviously. Not sure when the bayonet comes into play, because that's a huge part of the charge. That'd be an interesting question for the comments.
He abandoned swords and halberds altogether, and he completely discarded the mounted lancer. Similar to the Dutch formation, the basic Swedish infantry tactical unit was quite small and usually referred to as battalion. Each battalion consisted of 408 troops and was still pike heavy. There were 216 pikemen and 192 musketeers.
Like 52, 48%, something like that.
Both pikemen and musketeers were arranged in 3 rectangular formations. The pikemen formed the center of the battalion and had a frontage of 36 men. The musketeers formed 2 equal groups, one on each side of the pikemen, and both had a frontage of 16 troops. The musketeers were equipped with modern muskets, lighter than the ones of their imperial counterparts. This allowed for further baggage and secondary weapons. According to Alan Williams, a 16th century musket could weigh up to 15 kilograms.
I really wish I was good at metric. I need to do that.
Early on in Gustavus's reign, he introduced a first reform and replaced arquebuses with muskets of the Dutch type, which weighed already only about 6.5 kilograms.
Half.
Later, he introduced even lighter muskets, ranging from 4 to 5 kilograms.
Wow.
It is controversial whether these muskets were used with or without a musket rest.
Less metal, more wood? Lighter wood? Probably.
Friedholm von Essen mentions that the Swedish musketeers were often depicted without a musket rest, but adds that the forks could presumably have helped with the recoil. However, scholars still disagree on this. What they could agree upon is that Gustavus replaced some of these forks with the so-called Swedish feathers. These were dual-purpose items. They were used as a rest for the musket, but they could also serve as an anti-cavalry field stake.
Okay, interesting.
Similar to the wooden sticks the English archers used at the battles of Crécy, Poitiers or Agincourt. It is generally agreed that they were used in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but not in Germany. They were usually used to enhance fieldworks or to defend against cavalry charges. This was a field the Swedish had mastered. They were quite good at digging. Frost even notes that the Polish hussars refer to them as moles. The standard mode of firing of the musketeers was the countermarch. In the Dutch school, this was essentially a defensive maneuver. The musketeers would fire in rank and then retreat in file to the rear of the unit, so that the unit could fire continuously. Gustavus adapted this concept but had his men march forward instead.
And you see this methodology be used continuously after this. I guess that's why he's dubbed the father of modern warfare. But this methodology of continuation of musketeers or riflemen or whatever you want to use, where they're cycling. I've seen that so many times, like videos that we've watched or documentaries of 17th and 18th. But then furthermore in the 19th century. So very common practice, it seems like, after the fact.
Instead, he also reduced the 10 ranks the Dutch used to 6. This required the man to reload faster and move quicker, which became possible due to increased drill.
And they also, I guess, they're supposed to gain ground while they're doing it. At least they did that in animation.
And exercise during peacetime, and a standardized caliber and powder charge. In addition, Robert Frost mentions that it is likely that the Swedish gunmen were forced to learn how to reload faster in the Polish campaigns by continuous heavy rain, which threatened to extinguish the fuses. The fast and continuous hail of fire made it possible to close in on the enemy while discouraging an enemy charge. Michael Roberts notes that this turned an essentially defensive tactic into an essentially aggressive one. In addition, Friedholm von Essen argues that Gustavus used his pikemen in a similar offensive fashion to charge enemies, while Maurits merely used them to protect his musketeers. In order to prepare such an infantry charge, Gustavus introduced volley fire. Note that he wasn't the first to do so, and that there is some confusion or conflict in the literature when it comes to the use of volley fire. For example, the historian David Parrott questions both the effectiveness of the salvo and whether it made sense to use it, because firing all muskets at the same time would have left the musketeers defenseless. However, there are multiple primary sources which attest to the use of volley fire. For example, at the battles of Mewe, Dirschau and Breitenfeld.
I guess it really just depends on who's coming at you. I mean, if they're wide, it wouldn't make sense. But if they're narrow, it might make sense. You know, it just depends.
At Breitenfeld, Lieutenant Colonel Maschamp explains that they countered an imperial charge by firing 2 separate volleys of 3 ranks each when the enemy came into pistol range, and then fell pell-mell on the Catholics with push of pike and clubbed muskets. However, this was a risky strategy, because once all muskets were fired, the infantry had to rely entirely on the pikes for defense for the next few minutes. Based on these primary accounts, many scholars disagree with Parrott. They rather see the salvo as a means against immediate charging enemies. Presumably, infantry tried to cause as much damage to charging enemies as possible, in order to reduce their momentum. This improved the chance of the pikes to sufficiently protect them, or to hold the charge altogether.
I wonder how much friendly fire came out of all this, because it's just, but it relies on discipline and rank and so much.
The Swedish infantry battalions were arranged in brigades of 3 to 4 battalions, resembling an arrowhead. One brigade consisted of about 1,500 men. Some argued that the Swedish brigade, especially in terms of size, bears a quite striking resemblance to the tercios. which were also often deployed in a wedged or diamond formation. The Swedish brigade is usually seen as a combination of the best parts of the Dutch and Spanish school. While the individual battalions provided the maneuverability and flexibility of the Dutch school, the depth of the whole brigade provided a staying power comparable to the one of the tercios. In addition, the Swedish brigade was well organized and had a high number of officers and NCOs, which allowed each part of it to react to enemy movement quickly and independently. This too was demonstrated impressively at the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, when a mostly Protestant force of Swedes and Saxons was pitched against the forces of the Catholic League, a coalition of Catholic states of the Holy Roman Empire. Often, this battle is cited as the moment when the new linear checkerboard formation of the Dutch and Swedish schools thoroughly defeated the old square-like tercio formation. Nevertheless, the tercios were not outmoded and continued to win battles later on. At Breitenfeld, however, the Swedes formed up in multiple lines with sufficient intervals between the units, optimizing for firepower. In contrast to the Imperial infantry, who stood in one line, they also deployed a significant number of reserve.
Tercios were arranged in a wedge formation. Oh, okay.
It is worth noting, however, that at Breitenfeld, the Imperials were outnumbered and thus had to extend their lines, which made it difficult for them to deploy a reserve. Their more linear and shallow formations gave the Swedes the edge in the artillery duel that opened the battle. It reduced their losses, while their enemies suffered heavy damage because of their massive deep formations. Shortly after, an engagement on the left Imperial flank ensued, while Tilly's right flank charged the inexperienced Saxon troops and easily shattered them. Reacting to this, the entire Swedish second line reformed under the command of Gustav Horn and formed a new line parallel to the Düben-Leipzig road to meet the Imperials on their left flank. Such a maneuver was not just risky, but also very difficult to pull off mid-battle. David Parrott sees this as the true innovation of Gustavus Adolphus, the proper deployment of reserve troops, who even at the brink of defeat remained disciplined. Such maneuvers required an exceptional amount of discipline and seamless collaboration. This was at least partly owed to the recruitment and composition of the Swedish army. In both these departments, Gustavus made advancements as well. He expanded an already existing conscription system. Every Swedish man, with many exceptions for nobles, clerics, and men working in the mines, owed military duty.
Okay. Interesting. I mean, across most European nations, I'm wondering in terms of conscription, this is a question for another comic question. What were the conscription precedents across Europe? Was it commonplace? Was it in need of war? I don't know. Let me know.
Each parish had to supply and equip every 10th male, who were drawn up by lot. This led to a strong nucleus of native Swedes and Finns, which was part of Sweden at the time, while the vast majority of the Swedish force was still made up of mercenaries. An additional factor contributing to Gustavus' success is the fact that he had a lot of control over the equipment and weaponry of his men. Most importantly, he could manage the proportion of shot to pike much better, which solved a problem that notoriously plagued mercenary armies during the 30 Years' War. Another prevalent problem, namely financing such a large army, was lessened by the expanded conscription system as well. Gustavus could pay his native Swedish forces in different means, such as land, which meant that the men were more confident they would get their pay.
Right, versus mercenaries, you can't really do that necessarily.
Another vital innovation were Gustavus' changes to artillery. Before his arrival on the scene, artillery was considered a speciality in field engagements. Geoffrey Parker, for example, points out that Maurits of Orange brought a mere 8 guns to the Battle of Newport in 1600. Cannons were important for sure, but more so during sieges, where they were stationary for a long period of time both on the attacker's side and the defender's walls. The heavy guns built for that purpose were often not brought to open field battles because they were too heavy to maneuver during combat. Over the course of a battle, heavy guns were often captured by the enemy and then turned against those who brought them to the battlefield in the first place. Gustavus introduced light.
We see a lot of that in the American Civil War. I mean, I'm sure it's commonplace in most wars of this time frame. and furthermore. But yeah, I've seen it so many times when I was watching the American Civil War videos where they'll have a line of cannon, but then they'll get routed, and they don't have time. I mean, it takes so much time to get those things going. Those are heavy guns, even though they're on wheels. They're heavy. Depending on the environment, they might get stuck. It's just a nightmare. It's a logistical nightmare.
Guns, which could be moved by one horse or 3 to 4 men.
Yeah.
It consisted of a copper tube reinforced by iron bands. It was wrapped in ropes with a final layer of leather, hence the famous term leather cannon. However, this innovation was soon removed from the arsenal as it proved to be fragile and dangerous for field use. But it was not long until metallurgic advances made it possible to develop a short cast iron gun, which proved to be much safer than the leather cannon. In 1624, Gustavus had created a gun which weighed only 625 pounds.
Oh.
These guns became known as regimental guns, since they were assigned to the regiments. It was the first regimental field piece in military history. All in all, the Swedes perfected the art of combined arms. Infantry, cavalry and artillery fought in unison and were optimized for shock value. This combination of different military arms had a great influence on the development of warfare. Clifford J. Rogers noted that by the second half of the 17th century, all major European powers had adopted the Swedish system. Gustavus's reforms helped Sweden to become a major power until its eventual downfall in the Great Northern War. He lastingly influenced military leaders and theoreticians, from Frederick the Great to Napoleon. And as Geoffrey Parker argued, it might indeed be the case that Gustavus would have understood the underlying concepts governing warfare at the Western Front in 1914. But not only would he have been amazed by the rate of fire, equipment, and logistical possibilities, but also astonished by the rather strange fashion habits of 20th century soldiers.
Interesting stuff. Like I said, this video very new to me. This part of the world and part of history, where like I said at the beginning, you kind of mend the old-fashioned warfare to the modern warfare. Dubbed the video "The Father of Modern Warfare." Crazy to see kind of how things evolve and how tactics evolve as things get more evolved, right? Whether it be the cavalry, whether it be the cannons, the metallurgy impacts of the cannons, the rifles, lighter rifles, better efficiency with formation and rank and volley fire if needed. Whoa. And yeah, to the point, like Frederick the Great, Napoleon, and so many others probably looked at Gustavus as like a book of the art of war. You know, like there's an art of war within this. Interesting. I've never heard of this guy prior to this video. Naivete. Thank you guys so much for watching. Before we go, please, if you have any opportunity to think of any videos that could complement this era or enrich us continuously within this theme of 17th century or so forth, please type below. I'd love to see the videos that we might react to together. Thank you for being here. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out. Bye-bye.